Why postmodernists train, not educate, activists. Now here's why indoctrinating children and young people makes perfect sense to postmodernists and those trained in postmodern theory. Now most of us have encountered old-fashioned indoctrinators in our education. We almost always run into a teacher or two along the way, or a professor who thinks like this, there's one truth and I am in possession of it. So important is it that students must believe it and it alone. Alternative ideas are a waste of time, and they are a temptation to unformed minds, so those should be shunned. So as a teacher, I will use my authority and my power to instill only the correct ideas. Now, our modern ideal of liberal education fought a long battle against that view across several centuries. Now, it also agrees that the truth matters, but the truth is often very complex, and the exposure of students to contending theories is an absolutely essential part of the process. Students need on complicated matters, particularly controversial issues, need to know what the leading alternative theories and hypotheses are, and exposing them to the leading advocates for each of those contenders is the best way for students to sort it out. Students also need to develop their own strength of mind, to be able to think independently with confidence, because all through their lives, they're going to be exposed to new, complex issues for which there's not yet an answer in the back of the book or an authority figure who can just tell them what it is. That's what they're going to be dealing with their lives, and that's what education should prepare them for. Now, John Stuart Mill, in his classic work, now classic, statement of the liberal education ideal, this is from his On Liberty, particularly chapter 2, he argued passionately that students must learn not only the best answers, but also their contenders, even the failed contenders. And that a trained mind, and the mark of a trained mind is going to be one that not only knows the truth or knows the best answer, but knows the reasons for the best answer, and also knows the strongest criticisms that can be mounted against the best answer or the true answer. And not only that, they will also know the contender positions and what the best arguments are for each of those contender positions, and then, of course, how to respond to each of those arguments. So institutionally then, Mill went on to argue, if that's our idea of what it is to be a well-educated person, what this implies for schools is that schools should make it a point of hiring teachers from diverse viewpoints. For it's only by exposure to expert and passionate articulation of varied viewpoints will students get a first-rate education. Now, I can't resist anecdotally here praising my undergraduate education at the University of Guelph in Canada. It's mostly known as a strong university in the biological sciences, but it had a great philosophy department in my experience, and it served me very well. And when I was there for a while, I found out the story of how it came to have. It had 20 professors, I believe, of philosophy, and there wasn't a single professor that agreed with any of the other professors on any overall philosophical outlook. And what I learned was that the then chairman of the department, Professor Bruce was his name, John Bruce, I think his first name was, had been a skeptic at the university when the university's department was much smaller, but they realized the baby boom was coming, so he was then authorized to expand the department from, I believe, 8 professors up to 20. So he basically went to the American Philosophical Association and the Canadian Philosophical Association meetings intending to hire, and he went with a shopping list. And the way he put it was, he said, well, I took stock. He was a skeptic, so he didn't particularly have any axes to grind. It was to say, I need to have professors who are representative of each of the major traditions in philosophy. So we've got 8 professors now. He went through the list of what their outlook was, but then he said, I realize, we need a Nietzschean, we need a Thomist, right? We need a Platonist, we need a Popperian, and he went through, and He explicitly then hired people based on their ability to contribute to the diversity of the department. So my undergraduate career then was a matter of a large number of philosophy courses. I think I ended up taking 22 courses in philosophy. Many of them were from professors all over the map. And so from the John Stuart Mill perspective, that is the perfect education. Now, that ideal of liberal education with a diverse intellectual faculty and its purpose being to train students to think for themselves about complicated and controversial issues, that did win out. But now we come to our generation, and we are surprised, most of us, by the resurgence, right, of angry activism, and much of it seems to be led by large numbers of students and recent graduates who are very confrontational and completely uninterested in debate. And in many cases, they seem to be unaware that there is anything to debate, or they seem to be in a state of disbelief that there really is anything that needs to be debated. They are the products of a new-fashioned indoctrination, and it's one that results from the groundwork laid by now 2 generations of postmodern ideology. Now, if we go back to the 1950s and the 1960s, we find first-rate philosophers, Michel Foucault, Richard Rorty, Jacques Derrida, and others, casting a very suspicious eye upon the concept of truth, right? And I'm putting that in scare quotes, and who are substituting group relativized narratives. They're just stories, and there are multiple ones, and no one of them has a better claim to truth than any of the others. They then will go on to lament, in some cases, that those narratives are in brutal conflict, right, with each other, and we have no way of resolving those conflicts by appealing to the traditional tools of reason, analysis, and argument, because we are becoming skeptical of those. As a result, the way Richard Rorty puts it, we cannot escape, right, our own, quote, ethnocentric predicament, unquote. And Rorty went on to claim that, there is no way to get to the truth or any sort of objective thing, so all we can do is, quote, we must, in practice, privilege our own group, unquote. And of course, other groups are doing the same thing. They are privileging their narrative and their values, and if they're in conflict with each other, well, the result has to be rather brutal. Now, Rorty was trying to say we should not be too brutal down this road, just recognize our ethnocentric predicament, but in this first generation, he is identifying it as philosophically inescapable. Now, ethnocentric predicament is one possibility. Of course, it can be race group predicament, it can be sex and or gender group predicament. There are any number of social dimensions that we can see individuals as being trapped in and in conflict with the others. Now, that's the first step. If the truth is out and our predicament really is one of just racial, gender, ethnic group conflict, then what does this imply for the purpose of education? What's the next step going to be here? Well, Michel Foucault was quite explicit about the implications of the death of truth. He, as a younger man, had been a true believer in the communist truth, that one overarching meta-narrative. But he fell away from communism. He left the French Communist Party for a couple of reasons. One was, of course, the incredible rigidity of the party and the fact that the French Communist Party was taking marching orders from Moscow. But also, at this point, he was and had recently finished his Ph.D.s in philosophy and in psychology, and those had left a stamp on him as well. But if truth in any capital T sense, or any sense of objectivity, or the idea that ultimately there's a one right or best answer is out, what are we then going to do? Well, at one point, he's speaking somewhat autobiographically, he speaks of his semi-mentor Jean-Paul Sartre, and he says, quote, Sartre, at this time, renounced all philosophical speculation, properly speaking, and invested his own philosophical activity in behavior that was political, unquote. That is to say, Sartre, he noticed, was doing the same sort of thing that he Foucault was thinking about. If we're not doing philosophy for the sake of philosophy with philosophy's traditional aims, what we might as well do that is renounce that and go straight to the politics. And we're only doing philosophy as a way of extending our political aspirations, whatever our political aspirations happen to be. Contemporary, very perceptive intellectual historian, Mark Lilla, writing of this era, 1950s and 1960s, talking about how many schools of philosophy abandoned their traditional understanding of what philosophy was about. And the way he put it this way was, quote, this is Mark Lilla's words now, politics dictated and philosophy wrote, unquote. So we get, at best, philosophy as a rationalization for previously non-objective, non-truth-based, non-fact-based commitments to normative positions. And that then dictates the second position, or rather the second step with respect to education. Education should be politicized. Now, what kind of politics, though, if we're going to politicize education? Well, for the first generation postmoderns, this is still 1950s, 1960s, orthodox Marxism no longer really was tenable. So there was widespread movement on the left that leftism needed to be fought after basically a century of dominance by Marxism and neo-Marxism. Something more dramatic was going to be needed. But it was going to be something, as Jacques Derrida, the deconstructionist, put it this way. He said, we needed something, quote, in the spirit of Marxism, unquote, but without all of the clunky baggage of traditional Marxism. And so what we see is the kind of politicization that emerges is going to keep the Marxist themes of exploitation and oppression and its kind of relentless antagonism toward our current civilization, but it's going to abandon its faith in science, its claim that economics is fundamental, and the traditional Marxist belief that kind of the inevitable march of history is going to bring about the revolution. So if we abandon traditional Marxism and those things, then what we are going to adopt instead is the idea that subversive action now, that's what we need in order to effect the transformation. Rather than waiting for the march of history to bring about the revolution in whatever form it's going to take is something that we have to do by subversive action here and now. The next generation of postmodernists got busy. They learned from Foucault, Rorty, and Derrida, right? If we summarize so far, that we should abandon truth for narratives. We should abandon the individual mind for group social construction. And we should politicize the classroom with some sort of quasi-Marxism or something in the spirit, right, of Marxism, whatever that means. Then Herbert Marcuse of this generation, Jean-Francois Lyotard should be mentioned. What they are urging strategically then is, rather than young leftists thinking of themselves as outside the system, revolutionaries who are going to impose the revolution, what they should do is position themselves inside the system, see themselves as part of the system, and to work within the system to effect the kind of change. We need to join the system's leading institutions and then, from inside positions of power, rework its core beliefs and its core ethos. And we see this then starting to manifest itself explicitly in the educational thought of the 70s and 1980s. Here I'll cite Stanley Fish. At one point, Stanley Fish was reminded of John Stuart Mill's claim that a good educator is going to present his own arguments, of course, but then also his opponent's arguments, and he'll present those arguments in their strongest form. And when he was reminded of this, Professor Fish said, quote, "That's the silliest thing I've ever heard. You don't want to build up your opponent's arguments. You want to squelch them," unquote. So that's the third step. You just don't present the rival positions, the rival alternatives, the competing hypotheses. And if they arise in your classroom or in your educational institution, you suppress them immediately. Now, one of Stanley Fish's postmodern colleagues at Duke University, this is Frank Lentricchia, then took the fourth step. If we now succeed And this is, we can start see in the 80s and the 90s things like, hey ho, Western Civ has got to go, with the explicit point of abandoning and banishing from the syllabi and from reading lists all of the traditional works in the Western civilization canon. So if we can get all of the competing and alternative viewpoints off the syllabus, then what are we supposed to be doing, especially if we're not engaged in truth-seeking anymore? The point is going to be about power. You as the teacher, you as the professor, you have social power now. You're a tenured professor, say. And so your job, this is Lentrickia's words now, are, quote, to exercise power for the purpose of social change, unquote. Yes, you're not interested in truth or the advancement of knowledge. You are interested in social activism. You want to change society, and that's your job. So the postmodern educator's task is to train students, quote, to spot, confront, and work against the political horrors of one's time, unquote. So we take it as axiomatic that we are living in an oppressive society, an exploitative society, a terrible society, an alienating society, all of that in the spirit of Marxism language, and the horrors are spread across many dimensions with many victims. And your job then as a teacher is relentlessly to help students be aware of those things, to teach them to stand up to those things, and to work in an activist fashion against all of those things. So your job is now explicitly to train activists, and particularly angry activists who are going to do something about it. Now, I can't resist, as we're getting toward the end of this here, say more explicitly, obviously, this has implications for not only what's going to be on the syllabus or what's going to be on the reading list, what kind of professors we are going to hire, but then also when we are, say, in professional schools of education, training the next generation of teachers, what will the content of teacher training be like? But if we're thinking about the particular kinds of students that we are trying to train, it's one thing to say, well, we're interested in aware, critical, angry activists, but the language that is used increasingly in the last couple of years is that of a virus. Now, this is partly, of course, inspired by internet meme language and things going viral socially, but I've got tier 2 professors from Arizona State University who are speaking explicitly about the purpose of their kind of postmodern pedagogy. And what they mean is not something quite as benign simply as an internet meme. What they are urging forthrightly as a, quote, pedagogical priority, unquote, is that we train students to, quote, serve as viruses that infect, unsettle, and disrupt traditional and entrenched fields, unquote. Now, this is not simply there's a catchy or interesting meme that goes viral and it makes people laugh or smile or whatever on the internet. The kind of viruses that this is Professor Foz and Professor Karger are mentioning are Ebola and HIV. And both of these viruses are, of course, ones that infect their hosts, render its immune system weaker, and then destroy it from within. So that's what we're trying to do with the students. And in their view, tacking on again some in the spirit of Marxism kind of language, they believe that we live in a mindless and capitalist consumer culture, and that universities have sold themselves out to corporations, and so this is all perfectly the right activist. Now, the point of this is that this explains our current generation of angry young people who are coming out of schools, coming out of universities with all of their inchoate energy and fears and rage. Released from 12, 15, 16 years of such schooling, they only want to do something now. But what? They can just feel in their bones, because this is what they have been taught, this is what has been instilled in them, that the system that they are entering into is oppressive, that they personally are being set up for failure by sinister forces who just hate them or loathe them because of their gender or their race or their ethnicity. Everybody basically loathes everybody, and that they have a life of conflict ahead of them. And they have not been exposed much to other ideologies, nor trained how to evaluate them, nor how to think for themselves as individuals. Thrust unprepared into a hostile world, it makes perfect sense that their protests are simply going to be manifestations of their own internal rages and despairs. Now, once again, I'd like to return to the theme of this series, that philosophy is practical, and the results of applying postmodern theory to educational practice for 2 generations now. That is the great lesson of our time.